But first things first, the NCAA settlement proposal has ruffled the feathers of the Big East and the 22 other non-A5 conferences. Insofar as, here's a tweet from Pete Thamel, in that they the A5 was going to pay 40%, or A5 named in the suit, which still includes the Pac-12. They were going to pay 40%, and the others were going to pay 60% because I guess in the A5's mind...
You got that backwards. The A5 is going to play 60%.
Well, nobody's happy with it. The other 22 are not happy with this. They think that the money should come from other places, so they're not happy with the splits at all, especially some of the ones that don't have football, which is really what this is about. They're upset about how this settlement went down, or how it could go down. The Big East was kind of one of the louder ones about it, saying that it's not fair to each of them to have the same kind of per school limits or per conference limits that are kind of mathematically the same, even though most of this is about football. And the Big East is a conference full of teams mostly without football. So I don't think any of them do. I mean, like Villanova and all kind of schools don't have them. So they're objecting to what the settlement will be. I don't think there's really anything they can do about this, but this is a letter and a group that 22 other conferences are all kind of in alignment here, saying they're not happy with the way the settlement's going down.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, Villanova does have football in the CAA, but that you can understand from the lower level, I guess, leagues that are not sitting there with the autonomy, and I don't mean lower level disparagingly, but just, you know what it is, the non-A5 conferences, and really, remains to be seen if you're doing the autonomy. It's still the A5. The power part of it, though, is more of a P4 at this point, and some will argue it's a P2. It doesn't really matter. We're kind of splitting hairs, but for the point of this discussion, I think that if you are a school, especially that's a part of a league that doesn't play basketball, you're wondering, why am I paying so much of this tab when so much of this revolves around the back payment of, yes, athletes in general, but particularly football, because that's where so much of the money's come from. And so you've suddenly found yourself, without really being a part of the negotiations whatsoever, just sort of being blindly led by people in power who claim to have your best interest in mind, but really just seem to be looking for answers to end their problems, and then how all that trickles downhill, they're not really too worried about, because it doesn't sound like many people were consulted about this, particularly at the lower levels. So, they're racing towards a solution of some sort. You see the articles nearly every day now that are, pushing it along down the track seemingly towards closure. And even though it's not the end-all, be-all answer that many people want it to be, it is at least a temporary solution to some of the problems ailing everybody. So it's exciting on that front. But then when you stop and look at like how it actually gets done, the schools involved have every right to go, wait a second, what are we on the hook for? What part of this did we agree to? When did we say that we'd be up for paying this percentage of the payout? When did the Group of Five or the FCS or anybody for that matter outside of the Autonomy 5 agree to this? I don't know when they did, and certainly based on the reactions, they don't seem to have felt like they made that promise. So, you're seeing some pushback in 22 leagues that aren't a part of the A5, according to Pete Thamel, just saying outright that they don't support the model proposed by the NCAA for allocating back damages, which unreasonably impacts their conferences. They don't make a lot of money, man. They don't have money to just freely, willy-nilly spend. And so, I can understand where there's definitely some pushback and some concern about what this looks like for them. I think with the Autonomy 5, there's schools that are worried about what that looks like for them, so you can imagine what it must be like for schools another notch down. So, the A5 are still going to pay the bulk of that bill, but again, especially if you're like the Big East and you play basketball, like why would you feel like you have to pay some quote-unquote fair share when football's not a part of your equation at all? So that doesn't seem to be that surprising. But, they say in that complaint that we believe more than 90% of the back damages are attributable to A5 student athletes. So that would fall at the feet of the power conferences. And if that's true, then even more reason to push back and say, look, if we're only responsible for 10% of the back pay, how are we getting way more than 10% of the responsibility when it comes to the actual payout? So they laid out their reasons, and I think they're valid. I don't know how that gets responded to. I don't know like what the jostling is like when it comes to the negotiations, because I'm not even really sure who's negotiating and taking the lead anyways. All I know is Ross Dellender suddenly started coming out with articles saying that there's an agreement and a settlement in the House case potentially. And, I don't know how exactly though all that works in terms of who's making the decisions and who's agreeing to such decisions. So, yeah, that's an interesting piece of this. But, as we've seen time and time again, they sort of get shouted down or just muted eventually. I don't know if that'll be the case here because so much money's on the line, but it is an interesting next layer to this settlement that seems to be, rolling downhill, and it's just one of various, cases that they are trying to navigate right now.
Well, so the funny part about this is, so the proposal as it looks right now is 40% of the Autonomy 5 would take 40% of that. Now, the NCAA has a big chunk of this as well that they're going to pay from their reserves and different things. The Group of 5 has 17%. The FCS has 22%. The IAAA has 21%. And so the combined non-A5 would be 60% of that deal. So when I said 60-40, so they would like to flip that to where the Autonomy 5 have 58% of the total reductions, and then 16% to the Group of 5, 15% to the FCS, 11% to the IAAA. So that way, and look, their numbers look where the total loss of revenue spread out is kind of better for everybody except for that top group. Really, there who would go from losing just 0.61% of their revenue to 0.88% of their revenue. And so that's a lot of numbers, but that way everybody's revenue loss is the same across the board, especially considering that, like you said, Craig, 90% of the athletes that we're talking about here are A5 athletes.
Yeah. So, I don't blame the schools for pushing back whatsoever. In fact, I'm pretty much on their side, as far as this goes, because, I don't see where they're really in the position to, or where they got an opportunity to even, really make their case. It just seems like this thing got started and started rolling downhill when people thought there was a little ray of sunshine that maybe could solve some of their problems. And I don't know how much consulting there was along the way, but this likely is just another measure or step in the separation, if you will. And I don't mean the separation as far as like a super league or anything like that, but just between those autonomy schools and the schools that don't have those powers. Long talked about that, there's going to be your class of basically rule makers and those who just abide by the rules, basically. And as we've gone along, we've seen there is a distinct separation, particularly with the autonomy schools and those non-autonomous schools. So I think you're seeing more of that, and another example of that here. And where that leads ultimately, I don't know. But I mean, the only separation that seems to get talked about the most is the Super League, and I don't think that's the only separation we're going to be seeing here. I think it goes beyond that, and I think it is a separation even further of the autonomous schools versus everybody else. In this case, 22 non-FBS football conferences, and that's 22 conferences that do not play football that are on the hook for a lot of football money. It's not just the Big East. It's 22 conferences. 22 non-FBS football conferences. So non-FBS level, not just the Big East, we don't play football, but those that don't have a table. That's a lot of schools, man. So, interesting to push back and to see what the response to that is, instead of just, I don't know, if you're those in power, maybe expecting them to just say, all right, we'll bite the bullet. But we kind of talked about this last week that, I don't know, you just kind of assume that everybody's going to have their checks ready to pay up and move along and just be ready to go on to settle the next thing. I don't know how feasible that is for every school. And I can see where there are schools involved where no matter how little the check may be compared to what Ohio State's going to have to cut, like that's still going to affect them. And with Ohio State, they can cut a big check and still be okay. Or Texas or A&M or whoever, they're still going to be fine on the other side of this, and they'll make up that money in no time, whereas some of these are going to be like, they're going to matter to some of these other schools, and they don't have a check coming right around the corner that's just going to fill the coffers back up once again. So Yeah, there is something to sort out here. The quicker this House case can get settled and just move on to the next thing, I think the better. But I don't think it's just as simple as it has kind of been made out to be based on some of the reports of how this has gone so far.
Yeah, by the way, I'm told I look too serious in a hat. We'll see.
It's a different look.
It is a very different look.
I don't know about too serious. I haven't thought about it that much, but okay.
No. Yeah, I mean, mostly I reserve my hat wear for the weekends. When I really like to cut loose.
Right.
So, no, I like it is. If there's no greater like indication that the big conferences have been taken over by corporate America, in that they figured out a way to make people who don't do what they do pay almost as much as they're paying for the same thing. Like, this is on you guys. I mean, it's the House suit is, yes, it's about all these athletes over this time within the statute of limitations, but was not brought because of Kennesaw State. It was brought because of the SEC and the Big Ten and the Big 12. That's why the case was brought. If everybody was on the financial model that the other schools were on, we wouldn't be talking about this. None of this. If that was the model, as a matter of fact, if you look at what the FCS and how their budgets operate, they kind of operate how it used to be. Like, that's what, college athletics was. There's some good money here and there, but for the most part, that's not really, a huge, gigantic revenue, life-changing driver like it is in the big conferences. So for them to push some of this off is pretty brilliant corporate strategizing on their part to try to get it by. But they are going to, be hit with some resistance. And look, if there's enough people that can make them, switch up a little bit. And look, these things go back and forth until there is a settlement. So I wouldn't be surprised that, those numbers go down for the smaller schools and go up a little further. Maybe not to this proposal that they sent, but,
Yeah, I mean, just figure it out. I don't want to sit here and try to sort through their issues that they created. But, the NCAA is on the hook for whatever they're on the hook for. The big schools, I think should be okay in the long run, even though I think some of them will still be affected. And then the smaller schools, while I am saying I understand the pushback and, feeling like you're just kind of being handed a demand of hey, here's the check you need to cut without even really being consulted on that. At the same time, you aren't guilt-free here as far as the payment of players and back pay and things like that. So it's not as though you have no responsibility whatsoever. You've been playing in this system as well as everybody else. The dollar figures haven't been as high and the revenue hasn't been as high, but that doesn't mean you haven't still benefited from the system being the way that it has been for all of these years. So, yeah, there's some monetary value that you need to hand over yourselves. But as far as the jostling over what exactly that looks like, I don't think we've seen the end of the bickering as far as that goes. But will it be enough to quell the settlement as a whole? I find that highly unlikely because this is so important to everybody. So hopefully, this little sliver of the various chapters that are in play right now can get resolved and we can move on to that next thing. And there are many next things. But, I don't blame the non-autonomy schools for pushing back a little bit on the dollar amounts.